In 2022, a team of geneticists analyzing ancient DNA from North Africa uncovered something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the origins of one of the most iconic civilizations in human history, ancient Egypt. Not the Egypt of textbooks, not the Egypt of pyramids and pharaohs carved into stone, but the Egypt written in DNA. They extracted genetic material from mummified remains buried along the Nile, some over 3,500 years old. Then they compared those markers to populations across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. The results came back, and what they found is about to flip the entire narrative of ancient Egypt upside down, because the people who built the pyramids may not be exactly who we think they were. If you're watching this, hit subscribe. Next week, I'm breaking down the DNA evidence that suggests a lost population in the Sahara may have shaped early civilizations long before recorded history began. This is not just about Egypt. This is about understanding how one of the greatest civilizations on Earth was formed through migration, mixing, and survival. Because DNA does something history cannot. It records the truth. Every mutation, every migration, every intermarriage leaves a trace, a genetic fingerprint that cannot be rewritten. And when scientists began decoding that fingerprint in ancient Egypt, they weren't just looking for ancestry. They were asking a deeper question. Who were the original Egyptians? Where did they come from? And how did a civilization rise in the middle of the desert that would dominate history for over 3,000 years? To understand why this discovery matters, you need to understand what scientists were actually measuring. DNA is not just a code, it's a timeline. When populations separate, their DNA begins to change, slowly, predictably. Over thousands of years, those changes become distinct markers that allow scientists to trace ancestry across continents. The longer two populations remain apart, the more different their DNA becomes. But if they mix, those markers blend. And that blending is exactly what makes Egypt so difficult to understand. Because Egypt was never isolated. It sat at the crossroads of the ancient world. Africa to the south, the Near East to the northeast, the Mediterranean to the north. Trade routes, migration routes, war routes. For thousands of years, people moved through Egypt. But movement does not always mean replacement. And that's the key question the researchers wanted to answer. Was ancient Egypt genetically African, Middle Eastern, or something else entirely? They started with the oldest available samples, mummies from sites like Abu Sir el-Melek, dating from the New Kingdom to the Roman period. These remains preserved fragments of DNA that had survived heat, time, and decay. When scientists sequenced that DNA, they focused on haplogroups, genetic markers passed down through maternal and paternal lines. These markers act like ancestry labels. They tell you not just who someone was, but where their lineage came from. And when the results came back, the pattern was clear, but also unexpected. Ancient Egyptian DNA did not match modern Egyptian populations in Egypt. Not closely. Instead, it showed stronger connections to populations from the Near East, regions corresponding to modern-day Levantine and Anatolian groups. That means the people living in ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago shared more genetic similarity with populations from the Eastern Mediterranean than with many populations in sub-Saharan Africa. That alone was enough to spark controversy, because it challenges a simplified narrative that Egypt was genetically uniform or isolated. But the story doesn't end there, because when scientists looked at modern Egyptians, they found something very different. Modern Egyptian DNA contains a significantly higher proportion of sub-Saharan African ancestry compared to ancient samples. The difference is not small, it's measurable, and it suggests that Egypt's genetic landscape has changed over time. The question is, why? What happened between ancient Egypt and today? To answer that, scientists had to go deeper. They expanded their comparisons. They looked at surrounding regions, North Africa, the Sahara, the Nile Valley.
And what they found revealed a much more complex story. Because ancient Egypt was not built by a single population. It was built at the intersection of multiple worlds. To understand what ancient Egyptian DNA is really telling us, you have to go back further than the pyramids, further than the pharaohs, back to a time when the Sahara wasn't a desert. 10,000 years ago, North Africa looked completely different. What is now endless sand was once a green landscape of rivers, lakes, and grasslands. This period is known as the African Humid Period, and during this time, human populations spread across the Sahara. Hunters, gatherers, early pastoralists. They lived in regions that today are almost impossible to survive in. But then something changed. Around 6,000 years ago, the climate began to shift. The rain stopped, the Sahara dried out, and the people who lived there were forced to move.
Some went south into sub-Saharan Africa. Others moved north toward the Mediterranean. But one group moved east toward a river that would become the center of everything, the Nile. This migration may have been one of the most important in human history because it brought together populations from different regions into a single narrow corridor of life. And that corridor became ancient Egypt. When scientists look at early Nile Valley remains, they see something fascinating, a genetic mixture, not purely sub-Saharan African, not purely Near Eastern, but a blend. These early populations carried markers associated with North African hunter-gatherers, as well as groups connected to the Eastern Mediterranean. This suggests that Egypt was never genetically isolated. From the very beginning, it was a meeting point, a fusion zone, where different populations came together and formed something new. And that fusion is what laid the foundation for Egyptian civilization. But here's where it gets more interesting. When scientists compared ancient Egyptian DNA to populations deeper in sub-Saharan Africa, they found limited overlap, not zero, but lower than many expected. That doesn't mean there was no connection. There absolutely was. Trade along the Nile linked Egypt to Nubia and regions further south. Artifacts, cultural exchange, and even intermarriage are well documented. But genetically, ancient Egyptians were not identical to populations living far south of the Sahara. They were distinct, shaped by geography, shaped by migration patterns, shaped by thousands of years of mixing with nearby regions. Then scientists turned their attention to the Near East, and this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Ancient Egyptian samples show stronger genetic affinities to populations from the Levant, regions that include modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. They also show connections to Anatolia and parts of what is now Turkey. These connections are not random. They align with known historical interactions, trade routes across the Sinai Peninsula, maritime connections through the Mediterranean, diplomatic marriages between royal families. Egypt was not cut off from the Near East. It was deeply connected to it. But here's the critical point. Connection does not mean origin. The data does not suggest that Egypt was simply a colony of Near Eastern populations. Instead, it shows something more complex: shared ancestry, populations that diverged thousands of years ago but maintained contact over time. Think of it like branches from the same ancient tree, close enough to recognize similarities, different enough to remain distinct. This is why ancient Egyptian DNA sits somewhere in between, not fully African in the sub-Saharan sense, not fully Near Eastern, but uniquely North African, a genetic identity shaped by its position between continents.
and that identity remained relatively stable for thousands of years, from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom and into the late periods of Egyptian history. The core genetic profile doesn't shift dramatically. Despite invasions, despite foreign rulers, despite trade and migration, the underlying population remains consistent. But then something changes, because when scientists compare ancient Egyptian DNA to modern Egyptians, they see a clear shift, a measurable increase in sub-Saharan African ancestry. Not a small variation, a significant change. And that means one thing. At some point in history, Egypt experienced a major genetic influx. The question is not whether it happened. The DNA proves that it did. The real question is what caused it. To answer that, you have to zoom out from Egypt itself and look at the networks that connected it to the wider world. Because Egypt was never just a civilization, it was a hub, a crossroads between Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. And over time, those connections intensified, especially after the end of Pharaonic era, when Egypt was absorbed into larger empires. First the Persians, then the Greeks under Alexander the Great, then the Romans. Each wave brought movement, soldiers, merchants, administrators. But even with all that movement, the genetic impact from these groups was relatively limited. Why? Because most of those populations came from regions already genetically similar to ancient Egyptians. They didn't drastically change the DNA profile. But the real shift didn't come from the north. It came from the south, and it came later, much later. Between roughly the 7th and 18th centuries, a massive network developed across Africa and the Middle East. A network of trade routes, caravans moving across the Sahara, ships traveling along the Red Sea, routes connecting Central Africa to North Africa and beyond. These routes carried gold, ivory, spices, and people, because alongside trade, there was something else.
The Trans-Saharan and Red Sea slave trades. For over 1,000 years, millions of people from sub-Saharan Africa were transported northward, into North Africa, into the Middle East, and into Egypt. This is not speculation. It's recorded in historical documents. It's supported by archaeological evidence, and most importantly, it's visible in the DNA. When scientists analyze modern Egyptian genomes, they find genetic markers that are far more common in sub-Saharan African populations. Markers that were rare or nearly absent in ancient Egyptian samples. These markers did not appear overnight. They accumulated over centuries through generations of integration. Because here's the critical detail. This wasn't just movement, it was assimilation. People didn't remain separate. They married, they had children, they became part of the population. And over time, their genetic signatures became woven into the fabric of Egypt itself. This is why modern Egyptians show higher levels of sub-Saharan African ancestry compared to their ancient counterparts. It's not because ancient Egypt was disconnected from Africa. It never was. It's because the intensity of connection changed over time. The scale increased, the frequency increased, and the genetic impact became impossible to ignore. But here's where the story gets even more complex, because not all regions of Egypt were affected equally. When researchers break down the data geographically, they find variation. Upper Egypt, closer to Nubia and Sudan, shows higher levels of sub-Saharan African ancestry. Lower Egypt, closer to the Mediterranean, shows less. This gradient tells a story of movement flowing along the Nile, from south to north, over generations, gradually reshaping the population. But even with this shift, something remarkable remains: continuity. Because modern Egyptians are not a completely different population. They still carry significant genetic links to ancient Egyptians.
The original Nile Valley ancestry did not disappear. It was not replaced. It was layered, mixed, expanded. Think of it like this. Ancient Egyptian DNA is the foundation, and over time, new layers were added. Sub-Saharan African ancestry, minor influences from other regions, but the base structure is still there, still detectable, still traceable. And that's what makes Egypt unique. It's not a story of replacement, it's a story of accumulation. A civilization that absorbed influences without losing its core identity. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. Because even before the slave trade networks, even before the great empires, there were earlier connections that shaped Egypt's genetic story. Connections hidden beneath the surface, going back to the very beginning, to the first people who settled along the Nile. And what scientists are now discovering about those early populations might be the most surprising part of all. So what does all of this actually mean? After thousands of years of history, after empires, invasions, trade, and transformation, what is the true genetic origin of Egypt? The answer is not simple, and that's exactly why it's so powerful. Because ancient Egypt was never built by a single isolated population. It was never purely one thing, not purely sub-Saharan African, not purely Middle Eastern, not purely Mediterranean. It was something else, something more complex. A civilization born at the intersection of continents, shaped first by ancient North African populations who moved into the Nile Valley as the Sahara dried out, mixed early with groups connected to the Near East, creating a unique genetic foundation that remained stable for thousands of years. A foundation that built the pyramids, that carved the temples, that created one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. And then, over time, that foundation evolved. New layers were added, through trade, through migration, through centuries of human movement that brought sub-Saharan African ancestry into the population at a much larger scale. Not replacing what came before, but blending with it, expanding it, transforming it. This is the part most people miss. Egypt is not a static story, it never was. It's a dynamic system, a living timeline written into human DNA. Ancient Egyptians and modern Egyptians are not identical, but they are connected, deeply connected, through a genetic thread that has survived for over 5,000 years. And that thread tells a story far more interesting than any simplified narrative. Because it proves something bigger. Civilizations are not pure, they are not fixed. They are built through movement, through contact, through adaptation. Egypt didn't rise because it was isolated. It rose because it was connected. Connected to Africa, connected to the Near East, connected to the wider ancient world. And that connectivity is still visible today, in the DNA, in the people, in the story that continues. But here's the twist. Because even with everything scientists have discovered, there are still unanswered questions. Because the earliest Nile populations, the ones who arrived as the Sahara turned to desert, may themselves have come from somewhere else. A population that lived in a Green Sahara thousands of years before Egypt existed. A population we are only beginning to understand. And if future discoveries confirm that origin, it could push the story of Egypt even further back in time than we ever imagined. So when you look at the pyramids, when you think about pharaohs, when you hear the word ancient Egypt, remember this: you are not looking at a single origin. You are looking at a convergence of migrations, of cultures, of genetic histories layered over thousands of years. The DNA does not lie. It doesn't follow narratives. It records what actually happened. And what happened in Egypt is far more complex and far more fascinating than we were ever taught. If you made it this far, hit subscribe, because next week we're diving into one of the strangest genetic mysteries ever discovered. Ancient mummies found in the desert with features that don't match any known population in the region. and what their DNA reveals might completely rewrite what we know about ancient migration. Click the next video now, because the deeper you go into human history, the stranger it gets.